Eleanor stepped back, letting Mara inside. The cottage was dim, smelling of dust, old books, and the faint, cloying sweetness of lavender. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows. Eleanor led Mara to a small, cluttered living room, filled with framed photographs of younger versions of herself and what appeared to be former patients. She sank into an armchair, her hands twisting in her lap. "They weren't just missing, Miss Chen," Eleanor said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "They were taken, and not by some random stranger, by people who had access, power." She reached into a drawer of an old side table and pulled out a small, faded Polaroid. She thrust it towards Mara. The image was grainy, the colors washed out by time, but the subject was unmistakable. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8, strapped into a leather straitjacket. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror, staring directly into the camera. The background was indistinct, but the institutional quality of the room, the bare walls. The metal bed frame was clear. Mara's breath caught. Where was this taken?" "The hospital," Eleanor whispered. "The high-security wing, the one they sealed shut after everything." The girls weren't just patients. They were subjects. Mara's mind raced. Subjects for what? Eleanor looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. Memory, they were experimenting. Memory resets, erasing trauma or creating it. Dr. Voss was involved. He was the head of the psychiatric unit back then. He was idealistic. He believed he could help people overcome trauma by wiping it away. But it wasn't just volunteers. She met Mara's gaze, her own eyes filled with a terrible knowledge. They took children. The ones who were difficult or inconvenient, like Lila and Elena. After they disappeared from the mill, they were brought to us. Not for treatment, for testing. They were kept in that wing for weeks, sometimes months, subjected to procedures, drugs, hypnosis, things I couldn't stop. She tapped the Polaroid. That girl. That's Sarah Mitchell. She was 8. Taken from her home in 81. Her parents reported her missing. The sheriff called it a runaway. But she was in that wing. They told us she was volunteering for a trauma study. Lies, all lies. A log fire crackled in the hearth, the sudden sound making Eleanor flinch. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a barely audible rasp. They didn't just erase memories, Miss Chen. They implanted fears. They broke them. Lila and Elena, they came back once, briefly, disoriented, scared. They whispered about a man with a blue jacket, taking them into a building with no windows, about being reset. But then they vanished, taken again, or silenced. She paused, her face paling. And Dr. Voss? He tried to help them. He kept notes. But he disappeared too. Moved away suddenly. His files gone. Burned, I think. Or stolen. Mara's head was spinning. Who was giving the orders? Who had the power to do this? Eleanor's eyes darted to the window. The sheriff. Frank Vance. His father was sheriff back then. And the hospital board. Men with influence. Men who didn't want questions asked about accidental drownings or missing children. They buried the truth. They buried us who saw it. Just then, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame. Both women froze. Heavy footsteps echoed in the small entryway, 2 pairs walking with purpose. A man's voice, calm and authoritative, called out, "Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor, we received your anonymous tip about the Holloway case. Just routine follow-up. Open the door, please." The voice was smooth, practiced, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. Mara's blood ran cold. They knew she was here. Eleanor's face went white, her breath hitching. "They're here," she breathed, panic flooding her features. "They found me." Before Mara could react, Eleanor shoved the Polaroid into Mara's hand. "Hide it," she hissed. "Don't let them take it." The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to turn it. Eleanor sprang to her feet, her movement suddenly sharp with terror. She grabbed Mara's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Go, out the back, through the garden. There's a gate to the woods. Run!" The front door burst open. 2 men stepped inside. The first was Deputy Marcus Vance, the current sheriff of Briar Creek, his father's badge gleaming on his chest. The second was a man Mara recognized from Old Town Council meeting footage. Councilman Reginald Harrow, a man with a reputation for quiet power and influence. Both men looked perfectly composed, but their eyes were sharp, assessing. Eleanor didn't hesitate. With a final desperate look at Mara, she turned and fled through the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. The sound of her footsteps pounding on the wooden floor faded into the distance. Sheriff Vance's gaze landed on Mara, narrowing. "Miss Chen, isn't it? The journalist poking around old cases. What brings you to Mrs. Whitmore's today?" Mara stood her ground, clutching the Polaroid behind her back. She was a nurse at the hospital. She had information about the Holloway disappearance. Vance took a step forward, his expression hardening. Information? Or speculation? Mrs. Whitmore has a vivid imagination and a history of difficulties. Best not to trust everything she says. Harrow stepped beside him, his voice smooth as oil. Indeed, Miss Chen, it's important to distinguish between fact and fiction, especially when it comes to the painful memories of our community. 41 years is a long time to hold a grudge. Mara felt the weight of their presence, the quiet threat in their words. They knew. They knew what Eleanor had told her. They knew about the photo, and they were here to shut it down. Before she could respond, the back kitchen door slammed shut again. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Vance and Harrow exchanged a glance. Vance's hand drifted subtly towards the radio on his belt. "They're still there," Vance murmured, more to himself than Harrow. "Even after all this time." Harrow gave a thin smile. "Some things never change, Marcus." They moved towards the kitchen, their bodies blocking the exit. Mara was trapped. The photo was still in her hand, the only proof of the nightmare Eleanor had described. And now it was the only thing keeping her alive. The adrenaline from the confrontation at Eleanor Whitmore's cottage had worn off, leaving Mara exhausted and deeply unsettled. She returned to her modest motel room on the outskirts of Briar Creek, the Polaroid of the straight-jacketed girl burning a hole in her bag. The room was small, impersonal, smelling of stale smoke and cleaning products. She locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the photo. The faces of Lila and Elena felt closer now, their fates entangled with a horror she was only beginning to unravel. The next morning the knocking came early. Not the soft knock of room service, but a sharp, authoritative rap that echoed in the thin walls. Mara opened the door to find Sheriff Marcus Vance standing in the hallway, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. Behind him, loitering near the motel office, was Councilman Reginald Harrow. Their presence was deliberate, a show of force. "Miss Chen," Vance said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk. About your inquiries regarding the Holloway case." Mara stepped outside, keeping the door open but not inviting them in. "Sure, Sheriff. What can I help you with?" Vance held up a single sheet of paper. "This is a formal request from the Briar Creek Sheriff's Department. We've reviewed your recent activities, visiting Mrs. Whitmore, accessing public records, speaking to other individuals. While we respect the media's role, we must emphasize the importance of respecting the privacy of victims, families, and the integrity of closed investigations." He slid the paper towards her. It was a cease and desist letter, formally requesting she cease all further investigation into the disappearance of Lila Holloway and Elena Reyes, citing ongoing sensitivity for the families and potential interference with historical records. As it was signed by Vance and Harrow, so Mara scanned it, her stomach churning. "This case was closed, Sheriff, but new evidence suggests it might not have been resolved properly. Families deserve answers." Vance's jaw tightened. 41 years is a long time, Miss Chen. Old wounds. Best not to reopen them, especially when the evidence you're citing, well, let's just say it's not what. Harrow stepped forward, his smile smooth but cold. "Consider this a courtesy, Miss Chen. The town has moved on. Rehashing the past causes pain, and there are consequences for those who stir up trouble. For the town, for the families. For you," Mara's hands clenched. "Are you threatening me?" "Threats?" Vance laughed, a short, humorless sound. "We're simply stating the facts. Dig too deep and you might uncover things best left buried. Things that could complicate your life, your career." The implication hung heavy in the air. Before Mara could respond, Vance added, We've also received a report from the county archives. Seems there was a discrepancy in the microfilm of the 1983 911 logs. A technical error, they say. The section for July 12th was accidentally overwritten during a digitization process. A shame, but it means your source for that missing call is unreliable, unverifiable. Mara's blood ran cold. The retired dispatcher, Lester Granger, had been so certain about the call. And now the official record was gone, erased by technical error. It was a clean, bureaucratic way to erase her credibility and the truth Eleanor had shared. Vance held her gaze. See, the past has a way of correcting itself, for everyone's good. We suggest you focus on your current assignment. Miss Chen, let the professionals handle the rest. They turned and walked away, their footsteps echoing down the motel hallway. Vance didn't look back. Harrow gave her one last inscrutable smile before following. Alone again, Mara stared at the cease and desist letter. It was flimsy, but the threat behind it was real. They weren't just pushing her away. They were actively dismantling her evidence and isolating her. The 911 log was gone. The dispatcher's account was now questionable. And Eleanor. After today, she might disappear entirely, frightened into silence. She picked up her phone. Making calls was risky. She had no proof of anything yet, just whispers and a single photo. But she needed allies, fast. She dialed a contact at a regional investigative news outlet, someone who'd worked on similar cold cases. The voice on the other end was cautious. "This is sensitive, Mara," the editor said. "We can run the photo, but the pushback from the town, it's strong. And Vance has a lot of influence. You need solid, irrefutable proof before we go public. Something that can't be dismissed as technical error or old woman's ramblings." Mara hung up, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. The system wasn't just closed, it was actively hostile. Vance and Harrow weren't just hiding the truth about Lila and Elena. They were protecting something, or someone, that had been hidden for decades. And now, by reopening the case, Mara had become a threat to that protection. That night, she returned to her motel room. She double-locked the door, drew the curtains, and turned on every light. The silence felt thick, predatory. Just before midnight, she heard it, the soft click of a lock being picked. Then the sound of the door handle rattling. Someone was trying to get in, heart pounding. Mara grabbed the small flashlight she kept under the bed and the Polaroid from her bag. She stood behind the door, her breath shallow. The rattling stopped. For a long, terrifying minute, there was only silence. Then the sound of heavy footsteps moving away, fading into the night. They were watching. They were warning. Perhaps they were ready to make sure she didn't get any closer. The game had escalated. The official pushback wasn't just pressure. It was a direct, dangerous threat to her safety. The truth about Lila and Elena was buried deep, guarded by powerful men who would go to any lengths to keep it buried. And now Mara Chen was in their sights. The mill was a labyrinth of decay. Mara returned the next day, armed with a crowbar, a flashlight, and a growing sense of defiance fueled by the threats. She wasn't going to be silenced. The boiler room was the logical starting point, the heart of the fire that had been the distraction. On the night of the disappearance, the air inside was thick with the scent of damp concrete, rust, and that lingering chemical tang of bleach she'd noticed before. Dust motes danced in her beam of light, illuminating jagged chunks of fallen plaster and twisted metal. She moved carefully, the floor unstable in places. Mr. Alden had mentioned the foundation holding things, but he hadn't specified where. Then, near a collapsed section of wall where the floorboards had buckled, she spotted something odd. A single floorboard looked slightly misaligned. The edge lifted just enough to catch the light. Using the crowbar, she pried it loose. Beneath it wasn't the expected layer of subflooring, but a narrow rectangular gap leading downwards. Mara shone her light into the dark space. It was a hidden compartment, roughly the size of a small storage locker. Her breath caught. This had to be it. She wedged her fingers into the gap and pulled. With a groan of protesting wood and dust, the hidden panel swung open, revealing a small metal locker inside. It was padlocked, but the lock was old, corroded. Using a rock, Mara smashed the lock with careful measured strikes. The metal splintered, and the locker door swung inward. Inside, shrouded in thick layers of dust and cobwebs, lay a trove of forgotten objects. Mara's light swept over them, her heart hammering. First, a ledger, bound in worn leather, its pages yellowed but intact. The cover was stamped Briar, Creek Sawmill, Maintenance and Transfer. Logs 1978-1985, Mara flipped through the brittle pages. The entries were meticulous, detailing repairs, equipment transfers, even minor deliveries. But then, towards the end, the handwriting changed. Neat, precise entries listed transfers of individuals, names, dates, destinations. July 12, 1983. Holloway, Ellen Reyes. Transferred to sub-basement level 3. Status pending evaluation. Authorized by FV, Frank Vance. See, July 15, 1983, Holloway, L2, evaluated. Status approved for program. Reyes E, evaluated. Status approved for program. The entries stopped abruptly after that. Mara's blood ran cold. Transferred to sub-basement level 3. Not buried, not lost, taken, and authorized by the then sheriff, Frank Vance Sr., Marcus Vance's father. The ledger wasn't just a record. It was a ledger of abduction. Beneath the ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, was a key, small, brass, and inscribed with stark, block letters, sub-basement, no other markings. Mara held it, the weight of it almost unbearable. The key to the basement that didn't exist on any official map. And finally, tucked beneath everything, was a child's drawing. Done in bright, waxy crayon, the paper stiff and cracked with age. It depicted a small room with bare walls and a single cot. In the corner, a figure, a man in a blue jacket, stood over a child sitting on the floor. The child's face was smudged, but the message was clear, scrawled in large, uneven letters across the bottom. "Don't go in the red door, they'll take you too." Mara stared at the drawing, the child's terror radiating from the page. The red door. The man in the blue jacket. The basement. It all clicked into place with a sickening clarity. The mill wasn't just a distraction. It was a prison. A place where children were taken, held, and evaluated. She sat back on the dusty floor of the hidden compartment, the locker door gaping open beside her. The ledger, the key, the drawing, they were irrefutable. Concrete proof of a systematic abduction. Authorized by law enforcement, hidden for decades. The official story of drowning was a lie, a cover for a kidnapping operation. And the key in her hand was the physical link to the place where Lila and Elena had been held. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about two missing girls. It was about a secret prison operating within the town, sanctioned by the highest authorities, and the fact that the ledger listed both girls as approved for program after evaluations suggested they hadn't just been held. They'd been processed. For what purpose? Experimentation? Erasure? The drawing's warning about the red door hinted at deeper horrors within that hidden basement. Mara carefully gathered the artifacts, wrapping the ledger and drawing in her jacket to protect them. The key she pocketed. As she closed the hidden compartment and replaced the floorboard, the weight of what she'd found pressed down on her. This wasn't just evidence. It was a bomb. And now she had the means to detonate it. But the question lingered. Who else knew about sub-basement level 3? And what else was hidden behind its red door? The key burned a hole in Mara's pocket. Sub-basement level 3. The words echoed in her mind like a death knell. The ledger from the janitor's locker had been specific. And the child's drawing had sealed the dread. The red door led down. Not into the mill's decaying heart, but into the earth itself. Alden had warned her about the foundation holding things. Now she was about to test that warning. She found Jesse Vance, an urban explorer and local history buff, known for mapping forgotten tunnels, in a dusty coffee shop near the mill. He was lean, with ink-stained fingers, and eyes that held a lifetime of curiosity. Mara laid it out, the ledger, the key, the drawing. Vance's expression shifted from skepticism to stunned horror. "Sub-basement level 3? He repeated, running a hand through his hair. That's not on any map. The mill's foundation was built over old mine shafts. Collapsed decades ago. No one's gone down there since the 50s. It's sealed. But the ledger says it exists," Mara pressed. "And the key it fits." Vance studied the small brass key. "All right," he said finally, his voice tight. "I'll come with you. But we go in my way, quiet, fast, and we don't touch anything unless we have to. They returned to the mill at dusk. The air was cooler, the light long and slanting, painting the rusted structure in ominous gold. Vance led the way to a rusted metal hatch near the mill's eastern wall, partially hidden by fallen branches. It was reinforced with thick bolts long since corroded. "Old maintenance access," Vance muttered, prying at the bolts with a specialized tool, built to seal off the shafts after the collapses. Dust and debris tumbled out as the hatch groaned open, revealing a dark, yawning rectangle of blackness below. The smell hit them first, damp earth, rusted metal, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. A cold draft, thick with the scent of decay, rose from the depths. Mara's flashlight beam trembled slightly as she aimed it down the narrow, stone-lined tunnel. The walls were rough-hewn, the ceiling low and jagged. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a constant unsettling plunk, plunk, plunk. The air was thick, heavy, and tasted of iron. "Staying close," Vance warned, his own light cutting a swath ahead. "No wandering off. This place is a death trap." They descended a flight of narrow, crumbling stone stairs, the key clutched in Mara's hand. The tunnel sloped downwards, the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in. The only sounds were their careful footsteps, the drip of water, and the frantic beating of Mara's heart. The tunnel narrowed, the stone walls closing in. Vance's light revealed rough patches where the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing them into single file. The silence was absolute, broken only by their breathing. Then ahead the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Mara's light swept the space. It was a cavernous, unfinished space, carved directly from the bedrock. The ceiling was low, supported by massive, rusted iron beams. The floor was uneven, covered in mud, broken concrete, and scattered debris, chunks of brick, twisted rebar, shattered wood. Water trickled from cracks in the walls into shallow, stagnant pools. And then, at the far end of the chamber, partially obscured by a pile of rubble, Mara saw it, a heavy metal door. Not the red door from the drawing, but a massive, circular hatch reinforced with thick bolts and sealed with a large modern padlock. The door was painted a dull, institutional grey, blending into the gloom. "That's it," Mara breathed, her voice thick with dread. "Sub-basement level 3. Vance approached cautiously, his light joining hers. "Holy, that's not mill construction. Look at the bolts, military grade. This wasn't built for maintenance. It was built to hold something." Mara took the key from her pocket. It was small, delicate compared to the massive bolts on the hatch. She hesitated, then slid it into the keyhole on one of the bolts. It fit perfectly. With a grunt, she turned the key. The bolt resisted, groaning, then clicked free. One by one, she unfastened the bolts, the sound echoing in the silent chamber. When the last bolt was loose, Vance and Mara wrestled with the hatch. It was incredibly heavy. Sweat beaded on their foreheads as they shoved. With a final ear-splitting scrape of metal on stone, the hatch tilted open, revealing a narrow gap of absolute blackness beyond. Mara aimed her light into the gap. It illuminated smooth, painted concrete walls, clean, sterile, and completely out of place, in the ancient, decaying tunnel. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature raced up her spine. Vance leaned in, his breath catching. That looks like a hospital prep room. Or a lab. Mara swallowed hard. "We need to see inside." Stepping through the hatch was like crossing into another world. The air was dry, cool, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. The concrete floor was spotless, reflecting the flashlight beams. The walls were bare, white, and seamless. There were no windows, only a single, heavy metal door at the far end, also sealed with bolts. Mara moved forward, her light revealing two small, identical cots against the wall. Each was fitted with thick leather restraints at the head and foot. The cots were pristine, covered in a thin white sheet that looked new. Beside them, on a small metal table, sat a single old surgical lamp. Its bulb was cracked, the glass dark with age, but the base was heavy, industrial. Vance froze beside her. My God! Mara's light flickered, then died. She fumbled for her spare batteries, hands shaking. When the light flared back to life, she swung the beam towards the far door. Affixed to it, slightly ajar, was a small metal plaque. The engraving was faded but legible. Procedure Mercury, authorized personnel only. Beneath it, a smaller plaque. Security Level 4, emergency use only. The implications slammed into Mara like a physical blow. Procedure Mercury. The name from the operating log found in the tunnel earlier. Not a medical procedure. A code, a program, and Security Level 4. That meant classified, top secret. Her light caught something else. A small rusted vent grate near the ceiling. Mara pried it open with her flashlight. Inside, coiled neatly, was a copper pipe. Not ventilation. Too thick. Too deliberate. A listening device? A vent for something else? A low scraping sound echoed from the far door. Not a human sound. A mechanical sound. Like metal grinding on metal. Vance paled. "We need to go, now." Mara agreed, but her eyes were locked on the cots. On the restraints. On the surgical lamp. On the name Mercury. The truth was here. Lila, Elena, they'd been brought down into this hellhole. Held here, processed here. As they backed towards the hatch, the far door began to creak open just a fraction. A sliver of light, bright and clinical, spilled into the room. Then a voice calm, dispassionate, and utterly devoid of emotion, drifted through the gap. Voice. "Intruders detected in sub-basement level 3, initiating lockdown. All personnel evacuate." The voice was amplified, coming from unseen speakers. It was followed by the sound of heavy machinery engaging, a low, rumbling thrum that vibrated through the concrete floor. Vance turned white. "Run!" They bolted back through the hatch, slamming it shut behind them just as the locking mechanism engaged with a deafening clank. The sound echoed down the tunnel, a final ominous seal. They stumbled back up the stone stairs, lungs burning, hearts pounding. At the top, Vance leaned against the stone wall, gasping. Mara stared back down the tunnel, her mind numb with the sheer scale of the horror she'd just witnessed. The cots, the lamp, the name Mercury, the voice on the intercom. It wasn't just a basement. It was a prison. A torture chamber. A place where children were held, broken, and erased. Vance looked at her, his face drawn. "We found it, Mara. We found the truth. But it was too much. For them." Mara nodded, the weight of the discovery crushing her. They had found sub-basement level 3, and in doing so, they'd triggered its defenses. The truth was no longer buried in the past. It was actively guarded, and someone somewhere knew they were here. Mara sat in a cramped, windowless radio booth at Briar Creek Community Radio, the scent of ozone and old equipment hanging in the air. Her hands trembled as she fed the cassette recording of the child's voice, the one from the storage unit, into the recorder. The distorted, terrified words of the girl describing the red door and the man in the blue. Jacket echoed in her mind. They took us into the building. No windows. The evidence from the janitor's locker, the ledger, the key, the drawing, was spread out on the desk before her, meticulously organized. She had spent hours transcribing key entries, photographing the artifacts, and drafting a script that laid out the timeline, the disappearance, the fire, the missing 911 call, the hidden basement, the ledger of abductions. She picked up the phone. She knew the risk. Going public meant crossing Vance and Harrow. But the truth had to come out. She dialed the number for Sarah Jensen, an investigative reporter at the Regional Briar Creek Gazette who'd covered the original disappearance, but had been dismissed when the case was closed. Jensen answered on the third ring, her voice sharp with skepticism. "Mara Chen? The blogger digging up old dirt? What have you got this time?" "It's real, Sarah," Mara said, her voice tight. "I've got proof the Holloway case was never closed. It was buried, and it's connected to a larger cover-up involving the mill, the hospital, and the sheriff's office." Jensen paused. "Proof? Or speculation? I've got a cassette recording of a child describing being taken into a building with no windows. I've got a ledger from the mill listing transfers of Lila Holloway and Elena Reyes to a sub-basement on the night they disappeared. I've got a key labeled sub-basement, and I've got a drawing from a child warning about the red door." Mara's voice rose slightly. "And I've got a 911 log that was erased, and a fire department report that doesn't add up." There was a long silence on the line. Then Jensen's tone shifted, all professionalism. "Send it all now, I'll get it verified." We go live tonight, 10 p.m., on the Gazette website and the radio. Mara agreed, her heart pounding. She uploaded the files, her fingers flying over the keyboard. As the transfer completed, the studio door creaked open. Mara turned to see Deputy Marcus Vance standing in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled fury. Behind him, Councilman Reginald Harrow leaned against the frame, his expression unreadable. "Miss Chen," Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you doing?" Mara didn't flinch. "Going live with evidence that your father's administration covered up the disappearance of 2 girls. Evidence that shows they were taken, not drowned." Vance stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his service pistol. "That evidence? It's fabricated, distorted. You're playing with people's grief, and you're putting yourself in a very dangerous position." Harrow pushed off the wall, his smile thin. "The town has moved on, Miss Chen. 41 years is a long time to hold a grudge. Reopening this, it causes pain. Unnecessary pain. And it looks unprofessional for someone in your line of work." Mara met Vance's gaze. "I'm not holding a grudge. I'm holding the truth. And the truth belongs to Lila and Elena's families, and to the people of Briar Creek." Before either man could respond, the radio studio lights flickered. A technician's voice crackled over the intercom. "5 minutes to broadcast. Sarah, feed is ready." Vance's eyes narrowed. "You think this will change anything? The town won't believe some blogger with a cassette and a ledger." "Watch me," Mara said quietly. She turned back to the console, her fingers hovering over the Go Live button. Vance and Harrow exchanged a look. Vance made a small, almost imperceptible gesture towards the door. "Time's up, Miss Chen," Vance said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Turn it off now or you'll regret it." Harrow added smoothly, "Think of the consequences, Miss Chen, for you, for the others." Mara took a deep breath. She thought of Eleanor Whitmore's terrified face. She thought of the child's voice on the cassette, describing the darkness and the fear. She thought of the cots in sub-basement level 3 waiting. She thought of the families who'd spent decades grieving in silence, believing their loved ones were gone. She looked at Vance and Harrow, the men who'd built their power on lies. Then she slammed her hand down on the button. Click. The studio lights dimmed, transitioning to broadcast mode. A low hum filled the air. Mara's voice, steady and clear, filled the radio waves and the Gazette website, reaching every home in Briar Creek and beyond. Mara's voice over radio. "Good evening. This is Mara Chen, reporting live for the Briar Creek Gazette. Tonight we are breaking a story 41 years in the making. The disappearance of Lila Holloway and Elena Reyes was not an accident. It was a crime. A cover-up. And the truth has finally surfaced." She began the broadcast, methodically laying out the evidence, the date discrepancy on the Polaroid, the missing 911 call, the ledger entries authorizing the transfer of the girls to sub-basement, level 3 of the old sawmill, the child's drawing warning of the red door, and the chilling cassette recording of a child describing being taken. She described the hidden basement she'd found, the surgical lamp, the restraints, and the name Procedure Mercury etched on the door. The broadcast was raw, unfiltered, and devastating. As Mara spoke, the radio studio filled with the sound of people reacting in the control room, gasps, whispers, the sound of someone covering their mouth. Outside, the town was tuning in. Cars gathered outside the Gazette office. Phones rang relentlessly. Hours later, the fallout was immediate and explosive. Sheriff Vance was forced to issue a statement from his office, his father's badge gleaming on his chest. "This is reckless journalism," he declared to a pack of reporters. "Miss Chen is spreading baseless, inflammatory lies about a closed case. The Holloway case was investigated thoroughly. The girls drowned. End of story. Any evidence she presents is distorted, fabricated, or taken out of context. We are reviewing her actions for potential legal action." But the damage was done. The broadcast had gone viral. Sarah Jensen followed up with a detailed article, embedding Mara's evidence and interviews with Mara. Eleanor Whitmore, who, despite threats, agreed to speak anonymously, and the retired dispatcher, Lester Granger, who confirmed the missing 911 call. The next morning, the town was fractured. Protests erupted outside the sheriff's office and the town hall. Families of other missing children from Briar Creek's history held signs. But the most profound impact was on Lila Holloway's mother, Margaret. Mara received a call at her motel. Margaret's voice was raw, trembling, but filled with a decades-long grief finally breaking free. "They were taken," Margaret choked out. "They were taken. Not drowned, oh God. All these years, I knew something was wrong. But they made us believe." Tears streamed down her face as Mara looked through the phone camera. "Thank you, Miss Chen. Thank you for giving us the truth. Even if it's too late." The broadcast also triggered a state-level investigation. The Attorney General's office announced they were launching a probe into the handling of the Holloway case and the activities of the Briar Creek Sheriff's Department under Frank Vance. Senior subpoenas were issued for records, including the missing 911 log and the fire department's reports. But the cost was high. Vance and Harrow retaliated. Anonymous tips flooded Mara's phone, accusing her of being an attention seeker, or even a plant by rival towns. Her motel room was broken into again. This time the Polaroid was stolen, along with copies of the ledger and the drawing. Her car was vandalized. Eleanor Whitmore disappeared. Her cottage vacant, her phone disconnected. The broadcast didn't just reopen the case, it ignited a firestorm. The official narrative cracked, but the system fought back fiercely. The truth was out, but the battle for justice was just beginning. And somewhere in the shadows, the men who'd ordered the cover-up were still watching, still calculating their next move. The days following the broadcast were a whirlwind of chaos. The Briar Creek Gazette website crashed repeatedly under the weight of traffic. Social media lit up with debates, theories, and demands for justice. But within the corridors of power, the responses swift and calculated. Attorney General Helen Voss stood in a stark, wood-paneled office in the state capitol, her expression grim. On her desk lay a thick file labeled Holloway Reyes, Disappearance Reopening Investigation. She picked up the cassette recording Mara had provided, her fingers tracing the faded label. The child's voice, distorted but unmistakable, played faintly through the headphones. "They took us into the building." "No windows?" Voss winced. This wasn't just a cold case. It was a potential scandal, implicating decades of law, enforcement, and local government. "Get me the forensic team," Voss ordered her assistant, her voice tight. "And pull every record. Hospital, mill, fire department, everything from 1983 onwards. Subpoena Vance, Harrow, everyone connected to that administration." She paused, tapping the cassette. "And authorize an exhumation order. For Lila Holloway and Elena Reyes, if their bodies were altered, we need to know." The order was issued within 48 hours. Order DRAG-EXH 1983-01 granted the state forensic team the authority to exhume the two graves marked as Holloway, L. and Reyes Eud in the Briar Creek Cemetery. The graves had never been formally marked as containing human remains. Listed only as unclaimed plots after the official drowning conclusion, the exhumation was set for the following Tuesday. Mara received the news via a terse email from Voss's office. She stood in the parking lot of the Gazette, the wind whipping her coat, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages, some supportive, many hostile. She scrolled through the email, the words blurring. To Mara Chen, from Office of Attorney General, State of State. Subject exhumation order, Holloway Reyes, Miss Chen. Pursuant to the evidence submitted regarding the disappearance of Lila Holloway and Elena Reyes and the subsequent broadcast by Briar Creek Gazette, the Office of the Attorney General has authorized and issued exhumation order JAG-EXH 1983-01. The order grants the state forensic team the authority to exhume the two plots, currently identified as the resting places of Lila Holloway and Elena Reyes cemetery plot, the 7B12 and Arbor 7B13 respectively, for the purpose of identifying human remains and determining cause of death. The exhumation will commence at 1500 hours on Tuesday, 14th of this month, at Briar Creek Cemetery. Your presence, as the primary source of the evidence triggering this investigation, is requested but not mandatory. Sincerely, Helen Voss, Attorney General. Mara's hands trembled. Exhumation after 41 years. It was the ultimate validation of her findings. But it was also a terrifying step. If the bodies were found, and if they showed signs of trauma, violence, or something worse, the truth would be undeniable, and the backlash from Vance and Harrow would be nuclear. She called Margaret Holloway. The line was static, then a soft, broken voice answered. "Mara is it true?" "Yes, Mrs. Holloway. The exhumation order has been issued. They're going to open the graves." A sob escaped Margaret. "Oh, God. After all this time? Do you want to be there?" Mara asked gently. There was a long pause. "Yes," Margaret whispered. "I need to see." "For Lila, for both of them." Mara agreed to arrange it. She also reached out to Elena Reyes's mother, Isabel, who now lived in a small coastal town. Isabel was frail, her voice raspy with emotion. "They said they drowned," Isabel said, her words thick with tears. "But I never believed it. Not deep down. Thank you, Mara, for bringing them back, even just for this." The days leading up to the exhumation were tense. Sheriff Vance doubled down in public statements, calling the exhumation a waste of taxpayer money and a desperate attempt by Miss Chen to generate headlines. Councilman Harrow echoed this, framing it as an emotional witch hunt that was reopening old wounds unnecessarily. But behind the scenes, Mara knew the pressure was immense. Her threats escalated. Anonymous letters arrived at the Gazette office, postmarked from Briar Creek. "Stop digging, Chen. You don't know what you're waking. Turn back now." Her car was vandalized again, this time all 4 tires slashed, the driver's side window shattered, and the words "Go Home" spray-painted in jagged red letters across the hood. Her motel room was broken into once more. This time, the thief left a small blood-stained rag on her pillow. No note, just a silent, terrifying message. Eleanor Whitmore vanished completely. Her cottage was empty, her phone disconnected. Neighbors claimed she'd gone to live with relatives. Mara had a sickening suspicion she'd been taken, silenced permanently. The morning of the exhumation, Mara stood at the edge of the cemetery, the sky heavy with grey clouds, and the forensic team in full protective gear was setting up a tent over the 2 plots. Margaret and Isabel stood together, wrapped in thick coats, their faces pale but resolute. Mara felt their grief like a physical weight. As the first shovel of dirt hit the cold earth over Lila's plot, the sound was disturbingly loud in the quiet cemetery. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Aris Thorne, supervised closely. The process was slow, meticulous. Hours passed. Finally, just before noon, Thorne signaled. The casket, a simple, unmarked wooden box, was lifted from Lila's grave. It was placed gently on a waiting gurney. Thorne opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded yellowed shroud fabric, was a small, fragile skeleton. Thorne's expression was grim. "No signs of water exposure," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Bone structure intact, but—" He lifted the skull gently. "There's a distinct fracture here. Parietal bone, consistent with blunt force trauma. And," he pointed to the ribcage, "multiple healing fractures. Old breaks." A horrified silence fell. Lila hadn't just drowned. She'd been beaten, repeatedly. Isabel Reyes, watching from the other side of the tent, let out a strangled cry. Margaret Holloway covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Thorne moved to Elena's grave. The process repeated. Another simple casket, another shroud, another small skeleton. "This one," Thorne said, his voice tight. "Similar trauma. Healing fractures in the femur tibia. And," he lifted Elena's skull, "a fracture here too, but also this," he pointed to a small, dark stain near the base of the skull, visible even through the fabric. Residue consistent with a sedative, quetiapine, a strong antipsychotic, used to suppress aggression or induce coma. Dated late 1983. The implications were horrifying. Both girls had been held for an extended period, beaten, drugged, imprisoned, and then, what? Disposed of in the cemetery, passed off as accidental drownings. As the forensic team began the detailed examination, Mara felt the weight of the truth settle, cold and absolute. The cover-up wasn't just about hiding a disappearance. It was about hiding a torture and murder operation sanctioned by the highest levels of Briar Creek's government. But as she walked away from the cemetery, her phone buzzed. "An unknown number," she answered, dreading what she might hear. Male voice, distorted electronic. "Nice work. Shen, you've opened a can of worms. And now the worms are hungry. Remember, Eleanor. Remember your car. Remember the rag. Don't get complacent." The line went dead. The exhumation had brought the truth closer than ever, but it had also made Mara the target of forces that would stop at nothing to keep the past buried. The fight for justice had only just begun, and the cost was becoming painfully clear. The Briar Creek Cemetery was quiet, the air still and heavy with the scent of damp earth and early spring flowers. Mara stood before the small, unofficial memorial wall erected by the families of the missing. It was a simple wooden board, weathered by wind and rain, leaning against a moss-covered grave marker. Dozens of photos, faded and creased with time, were taped haphazardly to its surface. Some were school portraits, Lila's dark curls framed by a crooked smile, Eleanor's bright eyes sparkling in a sunlit snapshot. Others were childhood memories, the girls laughing on a swing set, holding ice cream cones, standing proudly in front of their childhood homes. Each photo was a frozen moment of innocence, a life cut short. Beneath the photos, handwritten notes fluttered in the breeze. Some were prayers, others pleas for information, many simply names. Lila Holloway, Elena Reyes, we miss you. The wall was a testament to 41 years of grief, a physical manifestation of the town's buried pain. Mara traced a finger over a faded photo of Lila, holding a teddy bear. The child's face seemed to stare back, a silent accusation. She thought of the exhumation, the shattered bones, the sedative residue. The truth was no longer a theory. It was a horrifying reality. And yet the deeper mystery, who had ordered this, why, and how many others had suffered the same fate, remained tantalizingly out of reach. As she stood there, lost in thought, a soft rustle of paper drew her attention. Tucked into the corner of a Polaroid of the two girls standing by a sun-dappled tree, partially hidden by a faded ribbon, was a small, folded piece of lined notebook paper. Mara carefully extracted it. The handwriting was familiar, Eleanor Whitmore's. The note was brief, scrawled in shaky ink. Mara, check the orphanage records. Priority 3. Look for Project Mercury. They started here, before the mill, before everything. They won't stop. But the truth is bigger than they think. A chill ran down Mara's spine. Eleanor alive, or a final message from beyond. The note was a lifeline, a direct pointer to a larger, older conspiracy than the mill and the basement. Project Mercury, the name from the basement door, the procedure name etched on the hatch. It wasn't just about Lila and Eleanor. It was about a system, a program. And it had roots stretching back further. She pocketed the note, her mind racing. Orphanage records. Pre-1983? That meant digging into archives from before the girl's disappearance, potentially exposing decades of hidden history. But Eleanor's final words, "They started here," implied the horror had a beginning point. And if she could find it. Just then a soft tap-tap-tap sounded behind her. Mara turned slowly. No one was there. The cemetery was empty, save for the wind stirring the grass. But on the base of the memorial wall, partially obscured by a cluster of wildflowers, was a small hand-drawn piece of paper, left like an offering. It was a child's drawing, simple and crude. It depicted a lighthouse, tall white, with a bright glowing beam cutting through swirling clouds. At the base of the lighthouse, carved into the stone in uneven letters, was a single word, Mercury. Mara stared at it. The name from the basement door, the procedure, the project, all converging here. The drawing was unsigned, but the style, it reminded her of the child's drawing found in the janitor's locker at the mill, the one that warned of the red door. This was a message, a breadcrumb. The wind picked up, rattling the photos on the wall. Lila's smile seemed to fade, replaced by a hollow, accusing gaze. Eleanor's eyes held a silent plea. The grief was still raw, the loss still visceral. But alongside the sorrow, a fierce, stubborn resolve stirred in. Mara Eleanor's note and the anonymous drawing weren't just clues. They were a challenge. The truth was bigger, and it was waiting, buried deeper in the shadows of Briar Creek's past. She turned and walked away from the memorial wall, the note and the drawing clutched in her hands. The exhumation had delivered the brutal truth about Lila and Elena's fate. But the real journey The journey to uncover Project Mercury and the network that had orchestrated it had only just begun. And the lighthouse, glowing in the child's imagination, was the next beacon on that path. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and salt. Mara stood on the weathered wooden deck of the Briar Creek Lighthouse, its white paint streaked with grey, the structure leaning slightly against the wind. Below, the dark, churning waters of the inlet whispered secrets. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its beam long since dark, but the keeper's logbook had been found in a rusted metal cabinet in the keeper's quarters, a relic from the summer of 1983. Mara held the logbook, its leather cover cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed and stained. She turned to the entry for July 12, 1983. The ink was faded, but legible. July 12, 1983. Visitors, 2 young females, approx 8 and 10 URS, arrived at 0230 HRs via small motor launch from Briar Creek, claimed they were lost and needed shelter from the storm, provided them with blankets, coffee. Offered to call their parents, but they refused, saying they didn't have phones. Left at 500 HRs in same launch, no names given, no identification. Kept them in the signal room overnight. Storm subsided by dawn. No further issues. The entry was matter-of-fact, routine, but the details gnawed at Mara. Lost. In a storm, with no phones, and 2 girls, matching Lila and Elena's ages, left at dawn. But they'd vanished that night. How had they gotten back to Briar Creek? Who had the launch? And why had the keeper not reported them missing? Or worse, why had he complied when they left? Mara traced the faded lines of the entry. The keeper, Elias Thorne, had been a reclusive man, known for his silence and strange habits. His log was usually meticulous. This entry, it felt off. Omission, or worse, complicity. Had Thorne been paid? Threatened? Or had he simply turned a blind eye to something far darker? She closed the logbook gently, the weight of its secrets pressing down. The lighthouse beam, long dark, seemed to stare back, a silent witness to histories buried in the rocks and the sea. The log confirmed the girls had been near the coast that night, but it offered no answers. Only more questions. As the wind picked up, whipping her coat, Mara looked out over the darkening inlet. Somewhere out there, in the depths or along the hidden coves, the truth about Lila and Elena, about Project Mercury, about the men who'd ordered their deaths, might still lie buried. The lighthouse, with its broken beam, stood as a symbol of that unresolved darkness. The open thread wasn't just a story. It was a promise. The sea, like the past, held its secrets, and someone somewhere was still guarding them.